Hello, everyone. Eric Rennie here, and welcome to the 81st episode of the Writ podcast. There's been plenty going on in federal politics, be it a healthcare funding deal, unidentified flying objects being shot down over Canada. So let's just get right into it. And joining me today is CBC's Aaron Wherry. Aaron, how you doing?
Pretty good.
Good. Have you been watching the skies, making sure nothing's going to fall on you?
I have been looking over my shoulder for any helicopters, any balloons, unidentified flying objects. Very serious business we live in.
I think people were dismissing the possibility of aliens too quickly. I think that we should really consider it. I think we should start a royal commission.
We should keep open mind about these things. Royal commission?
Yeah.
Maybe we can get the Senate to investigate. If the Senate's going to be independent and is going to be more thoughtful these days, I can't think of anything else they should look into more than aliens.
Yeah, that would actually be useful for a change. Okay. Sorry to senators listening. Anyway, let's get to it. There is... it's now been a little while since the healthcare proposal was given by the government, so don't want to talk about the details of it. But it seems like this was a little bit of a reset moment for the government. We were talking about how this was going to be a big thing that they were going to be adding or coming forward with at some point in early 2023. The first few weeks of the year seemed to be going badly for the Liberals. They had some bad polls come out, which dominated a lot of the conversation. So did they get a win out of this now that it seems that the premiers are going to go ahead with it, even if they're kind of complaining about it? But was this a win for the government?
I think so. I mean, I don't know that it was a huge, resounding, victory that changes everything or sets the board or, immediately clears the path for Justin Trudeau to win a fourth term. But for one thing, they were on the defensive, right? There was lots of concern about healthcare, not just from, premiers, but from the public. Lots of complaints about the way the healthcare system was looking. Lots of medical professionals saying, we need big changes. And that conversation was all sort of coming back to, where's the federal funding? Is the federal government going to put up funding? The province is demanding, $28 billion a year more in funding. And that, I think weighed on the government because it looked like they were failing to act in a sort of perilous crisis moment. And so to simply just by acting, by putting an offer on the table and with some pretty big numbers for that matter, even if it isn't what the provinces wanted, I think that just by acting, it was a bit of a win for them to kind of put their foot forward and do something. I think politically, at least, it was a victory insofar as the premiers, for all of the sort of tough talk and huge demands they'd made, the premiers kind of folded pretty quickly on this, even quicker than I thought they would. I thought they'd at least put up a token fight for a couple of weeks. They didn't even give us that. And then I think the other part of it was that the Conservatives didn't have much to say. They had almost nothing to say going into the negotiations, if you can call them that. But then even coming out of it, they sort of said, well, federal government should be spending more. If they weren't spending so much on contracts for McKinsey, they'd have more money to spend. But then when the question was, okay, so how much more would the Conservatives provide? The Conservative answer was like, well, we couldn't really say. We'll have to see what the fiscal situation is when we get into government. So the kind of lack of a Conservative response, the lack of real sort of hard bargaining by the provinces, kind of makes this not easy on the Liberals, but it at least gives them something to say, like, look, we did that. There isn't really a better counteroffer on the table. And now we'll see how it's implemented. Not to get too bogged down in the details of what they propose, but there are some pieces here that are kind of long-term sort of data disclosure, transparency, information sharing, public reporting. Those kind of pieces could end up being pretty significant in the years ahead, but we'll sort of have to see how that plays out. But I think in the kind of immediate, there's a crisis, somebody's got to do something, we did something, it's pretty quickly dissipated and the conversation has moved on to sort of implementation and how these deals are going to play out.
Some of the premiers were a little bit more disappointed than some of the others. I guess you could put it that way. In the end, it is just money that's put on the table, and it is a take it or leave it proposition because the provinces aren't offering anything in return aside from services to the citizens that are also Canadian voters. But, you did see François Legault being a little bit more disappointed, saying that in the next election, Quebecers should remember that when they cast their ballot, that kind of thing. But is there then some sort of minefield for the Liberals when they get to the point where they hammer out these individual deals with the provinces? Because some of them might have slight differences, and then some of the other provinces might say, oh, wait, we would like that too. If you're going to give that to Quebec, then, maybe we could get that. Could that be a bit of an issue for the Liberals over the next few months?
There could be. I mean, we'll see how it plays out. I mean, I think the Liberal argument is the individual deals between the provinces and the federal government may differ because that's just the reality of the situation. The situation in each province differs, and so it needs to be a different offer in each province. I think there's, we'll see whether provinces really want to start going, hey, why did they get X and we got Y? But they would then have to kind of start arguing against, the uniqueness of their own situation. So I don't know that there's a clear argument for them there. I think on your first point, there is maybe more risk of the healthcare system sort of failing to kind of maybe not get fixed, but failing to improve over the next few years. And then maybe the discussion becomes, why didn't the Liberal deal? Why Trudeau hasn't fixed healthcare? Everything is broken, et cetera, et cetera. I think the weakness, though, still is what's the counteroffer? The provinces came into this by saying we need an immediate injection of $28 billion a year, which we never really got around to having a discussion about it, but it's just not realistic, right? The federal government would have to raise taxes or significantly cut spending to fund an immediate annual funding increase of $28 billion. So that made it kind of easy for the federal government to come in and say, we're actually going to give you $46 billion over 10 years. And so it's not clear what there's no realistic offer on the other side. There's the Liberal offer, and then there's not really anything. And so if the Liberals are going to be put on the defensive here, it's maybe if somebody comes to the table with a more substantive counteroffer. Now, it's also possible that in 2 years, if things haven't improved, maybe the Liberals are asked to pony up more money. And maybe that's how this gets addressed. But at this point, the Liberals are kind of playing a pretty strong hand insofar as nobody's quite stepped up with a really clearly defined counteroffer that you could compare to and say, oh, okay, actually that would be the sort of thing that would actually fix this. Like, if the Liberal offer is not going to fix it, what would fix it, and what's a realistic funding envelope for that offer? In the absence of that, I don't know that the Liberals are really going to be hit as hard as they could be on this.
The alternative, I suppose, or the threat that the premiers could have is that just to make things politically difficult for the government, right? That they could cast more of the blame for whatever failures are happening in the healthcare system onto the federal government. But that does get kind of complicated because I think a lot of people do still recognize that it is a provincial jurisdiction, and when you're making funding choices on tax cuts or education or anything, that you are allocating funds in different areas. If you have a surplus right now, like some of the provinces do, and you're complaining that the federal government's not giving you enough money, that is perhaps why a lot of them might not be going to bat too hard against it, because their argument starts to falter a little bit. It's almost like they can add federal underfunding to their list of grievances and excuses, but voters probably aren't going to take it out on the federal government that much, and might not have an opportunity to. Some of these provinces are going to the polls before the feds do, at least if it goes in 2025, right? So there is that kind of electoral calculation.
Yeah, and it would, again, if a bunch of provinces were in huge deficits and were really completely out of money and were closing hospitals, and it was a problem across the country, you'd have a clearer argument that, okay, the federal government really needs to step in here and do something. But it's not quite that clear cut. And as long as it's not clear cut, it's harder to say, okay, well, the one thing that's standing between us and a fully functioning healthcare system is federal money. And I don't know that anybody really believes that the one thing standing between the current situation and, the ideal situation is more federal funding. And so it's harder. I think the major weakness was less that the Liberal government was to blame for the situation and more that they just didn't seem to be acting. And now that they've acted, the conversation starts to recede a bit.
The fact that the Conservatives didn't make much of a thing about this, I mean, a lot of the premiers are Conservative and they're accepting the money, so Pierre Poilievre can't really go that hard against it. Does it remove it, though, as an issue? Because healthcare is something that the Liberals would do better on than the Conservatives in general. So if the Conservatives decide that they're not even going to get onto that playing field, then does it kind of just dissipate as an issue at the federal level between the two parties?
I think it sort of depends, right? Like if Pierre Poilievre is going to argue that everything is broken and Trudeau has left Canada a smoking ruin after 8 years or 10 years or however long it ends up being, problems in healthcare will contribute to that feeling, right? It's sort of, I imagine it would have the same impact that like kind of broader economic issues would have. Like maybe the federal government isn't to blame for inflation, but if you're mad about inflation and you get handed a ballot, you might take it out on the sitting government. So I think that's a potential issue. I suspect that the problem for the Conservatives at this point, particularly, is that they haven't quite settled on what they want to run on in the next election. And before they start committing to spending billions more on healthcare, they probably have to figure out, what kind of tax cuts they want to offer, where they want to put funding. I suspect they are just completely at a point right now where they're not ready to make big funding commitments. And so, eventually there is going to be some sort of pinch on the Conservative side. But I think where they have to make some tough decisions about, what they want to promise and what they want to run on. But I do think, like for the Liberals, the risk is you just put $46 billion over 10 years on the table. It should lead to some tangible things you can announce and point to, but if the healthcare system is still a mess, if people are still angry in 2 years or 3 years or whenever, maybe they take it out on you. So you better be, if you're the Liberals, you better be ready to defend your position or explain why what you're doing is enough. Because at the end of the day, the public may take it out on you and you may be the kind of one left holding the bag, so to speak.
And joining us now, Shannon was able to join us, so really happy, Shannon, to have you here with us from the Globe and Mail. Okay, Shannon, we were just talking about the Liberals, the Conservatives, kind of their positioning on the healthcare. Now, we're recording this on Thursday, and, the NDP has this motion about kind of talking about how the Ontario government putting in more private delivery funding is not a bad thing, or is a bad thing, and the government should, the House of Commons should denounce it. So the NDP on the healthcare funding, they seem to be in perhaps the most delicate position because they're sort of against it, but they can't go against the government too much because they still don't seem to want to go to an election.
Yeah, they're not in a fun spot, and I actually say that with like a fair bit of sort of empathy and not cynicism. I also feel like sort of the Overton window, like the acceptable discourse about healthcare has shifted noticeably in this country, I don't know, in the last 6 months or a year in a way that really doesn't help the NDP. I mean, we saw even Justin Trudeau, as part of discussing the healthcare funding deal, sort of praise the quote-unquote innovation of Doug Ford in Ontario, going to some private delivery models. And I think that used to be sort of one of our classic Canadian bogeymen, like it was like the red panic button that you could push to sort of scare leftish-leaning voters back into the fold. It's a panic button the Liberals were more likely to push than the NDP. But in terms of the NDP's kind of traditional territory and what they would normally stake out and defend here, it feels to me like the whole public discourse and what people have an appetite for has kind of moved on. So it's hard, I think, for them to get traction with that kind of argument because it seems like we've reached a crisis point where everyone has said, like, okay, the current system is not sustainable, like we have to change something. And so they're sort of like kind of left out in the wilderness defending this position, and I don't mean to make it sound purely like Machiavellian, like they're just, adopting a position to take. I'm sure they quite rightly believe it, or quite authentically believe it, I should say. But it kind of feels to me like the whole landscape has drifted away from where they are. And then, as you point out, they're also in a really tricky spot with their supply and confidence motion with the Liberal government, where I kind of think you could look at it through two different lenses. Like, you could look at it cynically in terms of political machinations, or you could look at it in a more idealistic, sort of pure way. You could argue that they have accomplished some significant things, that they genuinely, and this is certainly what they would argue, but you could kind of give that credence, that they've accomplished some significant things they really wanted to for Canadian citizens, with the dental care deal for kids, trying to shove the government towards some sort of national pharmacare plan. So you could say, if those are things that, as an NDP member of Parliament or Jagmeet Singh, the leader, that you genuinely want to make happen for the Canadian public, that's a win. But in more kind of cynical political machination terms, they won't get much credit. But the Liberals get to sort of thump their chests. But what the NDP does get is this perception that they're riding sidecar, and they sort of are not the masters of their own destiny. So it kind of seems like they're in a really unfortunate, like, rock and a hard place position to me.
Aaron, does the NDP have any options beyond making some noise about it, and just hoping that people see them as defending, public health care, but not sending the country to the polls, which probably would be even more unpopular?
Yeah, I think Shannon's right that the conversation on healthcare specifically has changed. It sort of feels like we reached a level of dysfunction where people said, well, Doug Ford said, well, we're going to have a bit more private delivery. And people went, sure, whatever. Like, just get the lines down. I don't want to deal with crowds. Whatever you got to do, just do it. I think it'd be different if Doug Ford said, okay, so we're going to make our private pays, and people are now going to have to pay. People are going to be able to pay for to skip the line to get an MRI or whatever. And I think the federal Liberal position, and probably the Ontario government position, is somewhat safe as long as they stay on the right side of that line. I don't know how much, if you're the NDP, I mean, they do have the trickiest position insofar as you want to be able to come out of this deal and say, look at all the stuff that we convinced the Liberals to do. But to get to that point, you have to let them, you need time. You can't, the dental stuff is going to take time to implement. Other pieces of it, just transition or sustainable jobs or whatever you call it. Yeah, legislation needs time to be implemented. So the NDP can't just pull the plug on this tomorrow and be able to say we got a bunch of stuff done. So what they seem to be doing in the meantime is upping the rhetoric and trying to push the Liberal government as hard and as far as they can, and be as critical as they possibly can. And I think if they're making a mistake, it's probably in that they're being maybe a bit too harsh in their rhetoric. Not that they need to give the Liberals a break, but I think Singh keeps putting himself in this position where he says, this government is failing, and it's taking Canada backwards, and it's making massive mistakes. And inevitably, the next question is, well, why don't you if they're so bad, why don't you defeat them? And they go, well, it's not really the time for that conversation. Like, so I think they made the deal. They kind of decided then to overcompensate to make up for the idea that they were sort of being the sort of servant to the Liberal master. And now they've kind of got to dial it back a bit to find some kind of sweet spot, because I just don't know that this government is awful and terrible argument can carry for like 2 more years of this government is awful and terrible, but we're going to keep them in power anyway. Like, I think they kind of have to figure out where the nuance is.
Aaron, could they end up talking themselves into voting down the budget?
Some days I wonder. Like, I really don't think we're going to have an election. I don't know why we would have an election. I keep thinking that everybody should just chill out until 2025. But then some days the NDP talks themselves into a position where I think, how are you going to kind of carry this forward after you've said, that you just disagree so vehemently with this government and you think it's doing such a terrible job? Like, at some point, don't you have to do something about that? I do wonder, and it is like, minority parliaments, we can sort of talk about people and strategists as if they all know what pieces they're moving around the map, and there's always a brilliant plan at play. But sometimes these guys just talk themselves into corners, and the next thing you know, we're in an election. So I do wonder sometimes whether the NDP realizes maybe where they're going to end up, or whether the Liberals realize that they might have to give the NDP a way to sort of get themselves out of the corner, so to speak.
Safe face.
Yeah, well, Shannon, do you feel... I mean, I'm pretty sure that we're all on the same page in terms of, an election seems unlikely, but do you feel like the odds have increased in some way because of this healthcare deal and what could come out of it?
I think what Aaron says about sort of the psychological side of this is really interesting and really, really smart. I think we being like our kind journalists and pundits, we often sort of make the mistake of thinking everyone's playing 9-dimensional chess, as he says. Like we kind of work backwards from the outcome and think it's like that meme of like the guy with the board with the pieces of yarn, like that everyone's out there like connecting the dots, when I think Aaron's absolutely right. There are moments when you gin yourself up, you gin each other up, you say like, this is the lay of the land, or this is where it's heading, we have to do this. And I was on Power and Politics last night, and the host Dave Cochran, I was saying that I was arguing in terms of the liberal ethics violations that I just, to me, the biggest problem is that there was no one in any of those rooms, in any of those offices who said, maybe not, like just maybe not. And Cochran was saying he argues for a but no guy, like in every organization. And it's sort of, you need a version of this here. If it's not to your political advantage, if it's not smart, if it's going to anger the electorate and exhaust the coffers once again, maybe you need to talk yourself back out of it. But to Aaron's point, and what we're circling around here over and over, is that the NDP is in a really tough spot. Like they can't punch too hard at their partners in, I'm not going to say something as loaded as in crime, but like at their partners in this deal. But they still need to try to look like they are their own separate entity. And part of that is made really difficult with the kind of big picture rhetoric that they've had, even going back to, I think, the 2019 and 2021 elections. Their argument, and probably quite a bit further than that, because the argument for, but what about the orange team, is the red team and the blue team are the same. Like Jagmeet Singh has been advancing different versions of the idea that neither Justin Trudeau nor Pierre Poilievre or Aaron O'Toole or Andrew Scheer, pick your Tory leader, care about the little guy. We're the only ones standing up for them. Like that's been their differentiation point. It obviously hasn't caught on much, but if you're lumping in the guys you signed a deal with the, quote unquote, much more evil blue team across the aisle, then you really get yourself into a tricky spot. I don't personally think an election is any more likely, because I don't think anyone else is ready to go in terms of just kind of thinking about it in mercenary political terms. But that could also be my own wishful thinking, because I just don't really feel like covering an election right now, and I think we all need a nap. But who knows?
We do kind of assume that they're all rational actors, but it wouldn't
exactly.
be the first
people.
Minority government to fall by accident, right? Joe Clark's 1980.
Yeah. And that's what I love about politics, but we sometimes, I think, forget that like politics is driven by people, and people have weird emotions and weird reactions to things, and they whisper things in each other's ear and wind each other up. So it's not like it's sort of like not fundamental, like not always an actual like rational set of choices.
Yeah, well, we elect humans to the House of Commons, and they act like humans. We're talking a lot about the NDP, but there's also another character in the House that has a big role. That's the Bloc Quebecois, and we're starting to see, increasingly, it seems, a lot of alignment between the Conservatives and the Bloc on a few issues. So we've seen it on the language, the changes to the Official Languages Act that are coming in, that the Conservatives and the Bloc and the NDP has actually been joining together, often against some of the Liberal MPs, particularly those from the West Island, Montreal. We've seen the Bloc and the Conservatives, get together on other sorts of issues as well, on the notwithstanding clause, for example. Aaron, do you see here a potential option for the Conservatives going forward? Because it's been kind of assumed that it's majority or bust for the Conservatives, and it has seemed to have been that way for the last decade or so. But maybe you can kind of see the ingredients of a future case-by-case kind of survival for a minority conservative government.
I think, I think I think the Stephen Harper conservatives sort of may have burned some significant bridges, or at least made things harder for their successors when they ran so hard against Stéphane Dion's deal with the separatists. And they talked about, giving the separatists power was the worst thing Stéphane Dion could do. Now, political parties have a funny way of forgetting what they did in the past when it suits them. So who knows? I do, that would be a natural, if you're looking around the house in the event of a conservative minority, you'd say, yeah, the Bloc is one potential partner for the conservatives, at least on a case-by-case basis. Now, granted, in a situation where the conservatives form government, the Liberals, at least for a little while, as you saw in 2006 and 2008, the Liberals for a little while would be in sort of turmoil and in no position to topple them and head to an election. So that would, free them up to a certain extent. But I don't know that there's, I don't know that the Bloc is making life particularly easy for anybody right now. I think they're sort of throwing sand in the gears all over the place. Even on the notwithstanding clause stuff, the Conservatives lined up to support that motion from the Bloc Quebecois, and then had to come out and explain, but just to be clear, we still oppose Bill 21. This didn't, just because we supported this Bloc motion doesn't mean that we actually support what the government in Quebec did. And so I don't know that they're making life easy for anybody. But that's kind of, sort of their purpose is that, they're a separatist party, and their purpose in Parliament is to kind of go up and create problems and fights and division and see what happens. And I think they are sort of testing every party at this point.
Shannon, we've seen that, the Conservatives have taken a little bit of a different approach to Quebec than we've seen before, where they're explicitly saying they might not have like a specific proposal for Quebec or special policies for Quebec, just kind of treating, them like any other province in terms of what they're offering. So does this kind of dalliance with the Bloc have, as Aaron just pointed out, some potential pitfalls for Pierre Poilievre going forward?
Well, I have to admit, I was sort of assuming that some of this, at least, like Aaron talked about the idea that the thinking was that it was majority or bust for the Conservatives. I was thinking that some of this, at least, was designed to maybe edge them closer to that they were trying to kind of do a particular version of the Quebec dance. I actually, can I be cheeky for a second, Eric, and ask you to catch us up a little bit on the fortunes of the Tories and Pierre Poilievre in Quebec recently, just to kind of to brief me up before I find a way to opine on it?
Yeah, it doesn't seem like that they've had much inroads. The polls generally have them in the same place that they've been for the last 10 years, somewhere in the mid-teens. Once in a while they get a better poll, sometimes they don't. Poilievre tends to do bad in Quebec when it comes to his personal numbers compared to elsewhere. So I don't see a huge outreach that's being successul. But for Poilievre and the Conservatives, for them it's like whether they can win 2 or 3 or 4 extra seats in Quebec, right? It's more about just being competitive rather than trying to swing for the fences, because they'll probably lose more elsewhere. So for me, that's why I wonder if the Bloc is actually just almost a better option for them in a future parliament rather than as a pool for voters.
Well, I wonder if there's a world in which they're trying to carve off just enough interest, and they're trying to thread that very tricky needle, as you alluded to, the notwithstanding clause support, but Bill 21, boo, and there's so much, you could put it in sort of I suppose, a neutral to kind way. There's so much delicacy around the federal parties opining on what's going on in Quebec, or you could say they're twisting themselves into pretzels that don't have a whole lot of sort of justification or firm, they're not really taking the moral high ground. It's political expediency. And I wonder if this is some version of the Conservatives trying to sort of have a little bit more appeal outside of the kind of constituency they've traditionally held in Quebec. I'm just spitballing, as Don Cherry says.
Yeah, John Tory, also very popular in Quebec.
Yes,
Speaking of the Conservatives, it does seem, though, that they have been hitting at almost everything, right? They didn't try to hit on the healthcare funding, but they have...
Which is interesting, right? Like, that seems telling. If you're kicking at the shins of everything but not that, that's a data point.
Yeah, well, Aaron was talking about how that, avoids future problems. But, we saw Michael Chong going after the Conservatives, or not the government, for the fact that we didn't shoot down the balloons, that the Americans had to shoot down the balloons for us. Aaron, are they picking the right targets, I guess, to use to pun intended?
So bursting balloons.
Some trial balloons, yeah.
Oh, that's good. That's good.
I missed that one.
I do. Yeah, I think so. Realistically, the incentives for opposition parties are probably to swing as hard as you possibly can at everything that comes along, and hopefully you connect enough that it matters. And there's not much. There's not a huge downside necessarily to swinging and it looking a bit silly sometimes. But I do sort of wonder sometimes, because there has been a couple of times now where, McKinsey on the balloons, where they've swung really hard, and then the facts have come out, and it doesn't quite follow that what they had been saying for 2 or 3 weeks really makes sense. And, so I don't know, the balloons, a lot of people got carried away with it. But the fact that they were ready to declare the balloons a mark of failure or inability to defend our sovereign territory, if they do this enough, if there are enough moments like this, they may start to have a credibility problem, and they may start to get accused of being, the boy who cried wolf. And at that point, they may start to get there may be some damage to their party, to their brand. This idea that, okay, yeah, they're saying that this new thing is a disaster, but they've said that about everything that's happened over the last 6 months. So how seriously do we take them? And at some point that starts to filter out to voters, and voters start to question what you're doing. And yeah, I do think as much as this sort of social media era moment kind of rewards the loudest voice in the room, there is some limit out there where once you've yelled and screamed enough and it hasn't kind of been backed up later by facts, where you could end up looking kind of silly.
Speaking of not hitting on everything, which the Conservatives didn't do when it comes to the Rouleau inquiry, that report is expected to come out soon because the deadline is just hours away. We saw the RCMP Commissioner Brenda Lucki announcing that she was resigning. I can't ask either of you to really predict what's going to come out of this or anything like that, but Shannon, is this something where the Conservatives maybe were smart not to hit on this? Because if Rouleau comes out with something that is kind of a mixed bag or says that it was fine to invoke the Emergencies Act, then they turned out to be pretty smart to try to stay out of it for as long as they did.
I hate to sound sort of like lazily nihilistic, but I've never been convinced that the Rouleau, kind of verdict, if you will, we know it's not a verdict, but like that report is A, going to land particularly hard with the public, or B, will change any minds. Like I just don't, I think whatever you came in with, I mean, this is almost always true, right, in public opinion, especially these days, but I think that particularly, even after 6 weeks of very public testimony and kind of this tantalizingly wonderful level of transparency, that whole situation, the protest here in Ottawa and the response to it, I think is very much one of those things that whatever your priors were, you were probably walking right back out of the room or out of any news stories you read about it. And so that means, like, A, I'm not sure the report is going to change anyone's mind, and B, if it does come out saying, naughty government, you shouldn't have done that, it seems like too technical a thing to really land with the public. Like, there will be predictable constituencies that will leap all over it, but they're probably kind of constituencies that we're going to anyway. There's no justification in the world that's going to make them believe massive, public rights weren't trampled in some way. Of course, like, it's hard not to imagine that Brenda Lucki's exit stage left is very fortuitously timed if the report, has a lot of very unflattering things to say about the federal police response to this, or if someone has to wear it. I mean, and to be fair, she did not present herself well. Like, you did not come away from her testimony before the commission thinking, well, there's an impressive person who was really, like, doing the job. Like, I don't necessarily think this is a case of someone being forced to walk the plank who didn't perhaps there's been plenty of legitimate criticism of her tenure, but it's hard not to kind of go to that sort of idea that, boy, if that report is scathing, won't it be convenient to be able to say, well, guess what? The person in charge of at least one of these bodies is out the door.
Aaron, I don't know if you have anything to add.
Not a ton, no. I mean, I tend to agree with Shannon. I think public opinion is kind of set at this point. I don't know that people are going to change their minds. I think the general attitude at this point amongst probably a majority of Canadians was that something had to be done, and this was something, and it seemed to clear it up. So, therefore, fine. The government will take a bit of a hit if it turns out that it acted rashly or it didn't. If Rouleau comes back and says it was completely unjustified, they didn't give this serious consideration enough, it was a complete bungle on their part. And there's probably some damage too, just to whatever Rouleau's going to kind of set out, which I think we kind of already know that there was a lot of bumbling going on in the weeks leading up to this at all levels of government. And, that's not a great look for anybody. But I think public opinion is set, and I don't think the opposition parties are in a great position to capitalize on any mistakes, right? The NDP voted in favor of declaring the Emergencies Act, and the Conservatives probably aren't in a great, aren't super eager to remind people that they were pro-convoy at the time. So, kind of like healthcare, I don't know that the Liberals are going to take a huge hit, even if they don't necessarily win big on whatever Rouleau comes out with.
Okay. We'll finish just on this one just pretty quickly, that there was the big story out of Toronto, John Tory resigning. Either of you think that this either has any lessons for federal politics or implications for federal politics, anything that we can take out of this? If you don't live in Toronto, which all three of us do not, do you care? Should you care? Aaron, let us know.
Yeah.
It's the biggest thing in the country. The second straight mayor is being sort of shuffled out of office in the midst of scandal. So that's not great. I think if there are kind of real world policy implications, it's more sort of whoever the next mayor has to get a crisis under control and has to deal with some pretty big concerns about crime. And those are issues that will play federally too. So there is some relevance to it. But those problems would also be the problems of John Tory. So it will be interesting to look at from that respect. I don't know that there's otherwise a huge takeaway for the public other than, probably any time a major politician has to resign over a pretty significant lapse in judgment, it doesn't really reflect well on the profession in general. So that's not great. But otherwise, yeah, people don't necessarily worry about this.
So they moved to Toronto, I guess. Shannon?
I'm struggling not to make a joke about how maybe we shouldn't further fuel the idea, Toronto's own idea of it being the center of the gravitational universe, but in a more substantial way, the big problems that Torontonians would highlight and that have crept up to the level of national news, the horrifying attacks on the streets on the TTC, housing prices, a general issue with people who don't have housing. Those are all issues that I think if you live in any city of any size in Canada, you have probably noticed upticking where you live. I hear people comment on it all the time just walking down the street in Ottawa. So to the extent that there goes Toronto and then there goes the rest of us, obviously the problems are perhaps blown up more there just by virtue of being a larger population. The problems seem more acute. It's, I guess, sort of maybe an interesting experiment or to see where the electorate is at, what kind of leadership they want. I think we get an amount of, I don't know if this is just my perception, I feel like we get a quantity of discussion of left versus right municipal politics in Toronto way more than we do in other places, maybe just because of the sort of size of things. I don't feel like we talk as openly about, is there a left-leaning candidate for mayor in Ottawa or in, I guess in Vancouver you would more. But I guess I just think it's an interesting sort of case study in which way will that city decide to go, which policies will be advanced to hopefully deal with some problems that are really gripping places all over this country. And you always hope there's lessons learned, maybe.
Shannon, I don't know. Are you from Toronto in any way?
No, I'm from Northern Ontario. I grew up in Sault Ste. Marie. This is why I have this low hum of sort of amused resentment about the Toronto Center of the Universe thing. Yeah, no, I'm a Northern girl.
I think we probably all share that. None of us being from Toronto.
Yeah, exactly.
But political parties, I think they do, especially Liberals, Conservatives, and the NDP, do have a bit of a Toronto-centric mindset. And I do think that the mayoral race is going to focus a lot of their attention, because you could have some candidates that are actually currently sitting MPs or MPPs from either of those parties. A lot of staffers, a lot of the strategists are going to start focusing, lining themselves up to those campaigns. So it's going to have that kind of effect. I think that could be distracting for, the politicos.
It's true,
like
Ottawa, a resource drain effect almost.
Yeah. So we'll see if there'll be anything coming out of that. Maybe some by-elections, things like that. All right. So there's been lots to go over, and we did it all pretty good. So I really appreciate Aaron and Shannon. I'm glad you were able to make it. And thanks again. We'll chat again soon, I hope.
Thanks, guys.